I want to know, first of all, what inspired you to write this book?
So what inspired me to write this book is I work at the Federal Reserve. I've been with the Fed since 2002, and I do historical research. So my job is mostly, looking at things related to the Fed and how they communicate about monetary policy and banking regulation. And over the course of my career, I would read these little snippets about Black banks that were created in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and you'd see them mentioned here or there. But you can never get like the full story about what happened to these banks. And they were interesting stories. And so I was just like, I want to know more. And so I went online and started looking, thinking somebody has surely written a book about this. And nobody really had. Nobody had really put something together. So we published a book actually called Let Us Put Our Money Together about the first Black banks. We published that book in 2019. And right away, people said, hey, we want to know more about these people. We want to know more about these communities. We want to know more about these strong banks and the work they did. So we've followed up now, and we're looking at strong bankers, strong banks, strong communities in the late 19th century and across the 20th century.
One of my heroes is Marylina Walker. When I discovered her and what she was able to do, I was floored. And she survived the Great Depression. Her bank survived the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Come on.
Oh no, I was going to say, it's interesting that across the board versus their competitors at that time, when you had a kind of wide open banking environment and you didn't have the safety nets and things in place that you have today, Black banks historically were very well run. They were innovative. They were strong community leaders. They were, in many cases, better than many of their competitors within their communities, as far as from just a banking soundness perspective.
So, tell us some other success stories. And before you got here, the first hour we were talking about the Freedmen's Bank, Freedmen's Bureau, and how horribly they managed the funds of hardworking folk who were formerly enslaved, who some had just fought in a war, put $1 a week, $1 every time they got paid, and they had amassed millions of dollars in this bank only to have somebody mismanage it. And, so there's a narrative in this country, and there's a wealth gap in this country that can be directly tied to those early banking situations, and also the disenfranchisement of people and leaving them out of the New Deal until the 70s and things like that. Talk about that a little bit, Timothy.
So the Freedmen's Bank, it's funny because some people still today, when I'm at events and talk about it and say, well, that was America's first Black bank. And no, that's not what it was. This was a government created institution. I think maybe there were a couple guys who their heart was in the right place, but they didn't really know quite what they were doing. And it got created by Congress very quickly. And it was never really a bank in the sense that that many of us think of a bank. So it was run by and controlled by wealthy Wall Street interests who used it for their own purposes to offset some of the bad deals and things that were going on with their financial institutions. And importantly, as you think of a bank, the thing it wasn't doing at all is it wasn't lending back to the community. And that's something that you talked about Maggie Walker. I mean, that's, her saying was, let us put our money together. We borrowed the title of our first book from her. And what that is, hey, the community's got some excess funds. We have financial resources. If we put our money together, we can go out and we can lend that money, and it can be used to start businesses and help people get homes and help people get education. Freedmen's Bank wasn't doing any of that stuff. And it was poorly regulated, poorly set up. And they brought in Frederick Douglass at, the 11th hour when the thing was already, heading into the ground. And, he didn't know that, and they lied to him, and it went under. It was terrible. The most anybody got out of it was 60 cents on the dollar, and you had to maintain a mailing address. This went on for a number of years, and a lot of people, it just wasn't worth the effort. They didn't even have the means. You're talking some accounts that, just have a few dollars in them at that time. So it was
again, a perspective again. Yeah. Bondage for 400, 300 plus years. You're enslaved. You're now free. You're told all the money that you make, put it here. We got you. We're going to save it for you, for your children's children. You can build a legacy. And people did it. To the tune of millions of dollars. You talk about 4 million people released from bondage. Were able to amass millions of dollars in a short period of time, only to have it completely wiped out.
And they Yeah, and they, it wasn't a part of the Freedmen's Bureau, but they allowed them to sort of get intermingled in people's minds. So the Freedmen's Bureau is doing things like, bringing people food and reuniting families and doing all that good work. And then you got the bank there that's sort of living off that reputation. And they've, you can look at some of their brochures and they've got, Abe Lincoln on there and showing all this thing that you can trust it. And it was not, it was not trustworthy at all. It was terrible.
As a person that worked for the the Federal Reserve, I'm sorry, which is not a government run agency, right? It's
Right.
talk a little bit about the structure of the Federal Reserve, because I think a lot of people are, it's on our money,
Right.
It's like, what's the relationship?
Yeah. So without getting into a long story of central banking history in the United States, which would probably put most of your audience to sleep. The idea of the Fed is that you've got a blending of the public sector and the private sector in the Fed's governance. So you've got a board of governors in Washington, D.C. that's a government agency that's got broad oversight. And then you've got 12 independent regional Federal Reserve banks that are under the direction of local boards of directors. So even though the board of governors has oversight, you can think about those reserve banks as sort of the operating arms of the Federal Reserve. So the idea is you sort of want a balance of power between the public sector and the private sector in the Fed's governance. I work at the Kansas City Fed, so I work at a regional Federal Reserve Bank.
And do you think that that works? Because, as we think about money and wealth in this country, and I need us to think about wealth and wealth building, it's interesting to me that the Feds can, raise interest rates, lower interest rates, shift the economy as needed. And there's no real governmental oversight per se, although the Federal Reserve chairman can be appointed, I guess, by the president. But
right. Well, and the Fed, the Fed was created by Congress. It's accountable to Congress. Congress has, over the years, come in, did a lot of things in the 1930s to change the Fed structure. Has done things more recently, not necessarily things that grab headlines, but changes within the Fed. And so it's not accurate to sort of think of the Fed, we're out here just sort of doing whatever we want, right? Congress creates banking laws and, we are a regulator and we go out and we, implement those and things like that. So, the Fed was a very innovative structure when it was created. Prior to that, you had in other developed countries, you had, total private sector control of your financial system. And people didn't like that for obvious reasons. And then when Alexander Hamilton came along, and if you go back into early US history, he really didn't like the idea of politicians having too much control over your central bank, because you don't want sort of political gamesmanship to become intertwined with your money. He was very worried about that.
Timothy Todd is here. The book is called A Great Moral and Social Force, A History of Black Banks. Why that title?
So that title actually comes from a newspaper article in the early 1900s, and it was about a Black bank that was created in Birmingham, Alabama. And that banker talked about some of the reasons that he created it. And one of them was he learned about a couple small African-American children in his community whose parents died, and there was no one in their family who could post bond to help these kids out to have access to their parents' estate. And so that money was lost. And the journalist writing about that event said that it proved that a banking institution is sometimes a great moral and social force. And so that's where we got the title from that. And it reflects the banks we talk about too. When we look at, you look at Memphis at the beginning of the civil rights era, I mean, banks are really at the forefront there. And that's something you see time and again through history, and something that we talk quite a bit about in this book.
Hollywood immortalized Joe Morris and Bernard Garrett in a film 2020 called The Banker, starring Samuel L. Jackson and Anthony Mackie. And for many of us, it's the first time we knew about them.
Right.
So why? So first, tell us the biggest revelation you had in doing research for this book. Something that you were like, "Wow, why didn't we know this?"
Pretty much all of it, right? Because these are all stories about individuals who went out and created banks. And if you look at Richmond, Virginia, was really the cradle of Black banking. You had 5 banks there in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And, to really think about that, first of all, every individual involved in this had a phenomenal story, right? Some of them were born enslaved and had to really bootstrap their way up to to make a life. And then they're taking on just incredible risk in doing this too, right? So even if you go forward, you look at Jessie Bengay as a banker in Chicago around 1920. His home gets firebombed at least 5 different times. So it's just the bravery of these individuals and the community dedication and focus. I think one of the things that strikes people, or at least I hope it stays with people who read this, is none of these bankers that we're talking about in this book, and we're looking, basically over a century of American history, none of them were sitting there thinking, hey, here's a way I can make some money. Time and time again, each one of them comes to it and says, hey, here's a way I can help my community. Here's something I can do to help people get a leg up. Here's something I can do to uplift, create economic opportunity. That's their motivation time and again. And some of them it ended up costing them their own personal fortunes and putting their safety at risk.
Tell us the story of Jessie Bengay.
Yeah. So yeah, it's spelled Binga. He created a bank on the south side of Chicago called Binga Bank. Or Bengay Bank, I guess. It always tricks me up on the pronunciation. He was a self-made man who came up through real estate. His parents had been in some rental property when he was young. Came to Chicago around the time of the World's Fair in 1893, and really sort of worked his way up. And eventually, he was working on the railroad for a while, did some different things, started getting into real estate and going and improving his own properties. He was very handy, so he didn't have to pay someone to do the work. And then from that, he leveraged that and started doing more real estate. And then he had some wealth. And so if you're renting real estate south side of Chicago at that time, you sort of evolve almost into a banker because you are the wealthiest person that any of your tenants probably know. So they're going to come to you and say, hey, can I need to borrow some money, or I need to do this. And so he moves into banking and really becomes involved in a lot of things with the growth of the south side of Chicago and going and helping families as they tried to move in, and some of the challenges that they faced, some of the racial opposition that they faced as you saw the south side of Chicago expand into some previously white communities. One of the many interesting individuals in this book.
And what happened to this? We're talking with Timothy Todd, a great moral and social force, a history of Black banks. Jessie Bengay, Marylina Walker, Joe Morris, and Bernard Garrett all ended up failing.
Right.
Why?
So, it's probably not going to surprise you or many of your listeners, and I'm certainly not the first person to say it or to recognize it, that the Black community suffers disproportionately hard in times of financial crisis in America. And banks can uplift a community. They're a catalyst for community improvement, but they are also in some ways a reflection on their community, and their health often relates to the health of their community. And so when that community suffers, those banks suffer. And so, if you look at the bank, you look at Jessie Bengay in Chicago and Anthony Overton, some of the others who were in banking in Chicago in that time, you see the Great Depression coming on. And those are the first banks, the first community that suffers, and those banks suffer. And so in the United States, you go from a period, you've had this sort of run up from the late 1800s, you see an increasing number of banks, you get to the Great Depression, that number falls pretty dramatically. And then you basically don't see a new bank formed. There's some here and there. You have the banks in Memphis, hugely involved in civil rights issues. A few other places, a bank where I am here in Kansas City. You really don't see this really sort of take off again until you get to the civil rights era. And so then you see that number rise. Now, unfortunately, what we've seen over the last 20 years is you've seen their numbers dwindle pretty dramatically. Mm-hmm. And that's obviously very concerning for things like the wealth gap, all the things you talked about earlier, access to credit, how do you borrow money? And then overlay, take a map of any community and plot on it where your payday lenders locate and where your title loans locate. And, you don't have to run through all the data that I have in the past, just drive around your town and you can see that.
So moving forward, and I know it's not in your book, but I've been talking on these airwaves about cryptocurrency and, the blockchain, and Black folk are actually over-indexing in those spaces. And I believe it's because of the distrust of, modern banking, and mm-hmm. because of all of the things that you've discovered historically, that somehow crypto is looked at as a safe place for us. What are your thoughts of that on that? And is there possibly One United Bank is one of our sponsors, it's one of the largest Black owned banks in the country,
Right.
but it doesn't. I think it doesn't quite have $1 billion on its books, whereas the largest Asian bank has $30 billion.
Right. Yeah.
Give us some solutions. If there's someone listening right now that might want to start a bank in this day and age, is that even possible?
It's possible. It's difficult to do. I think if you have the wherewithal to engage in banking, I'm not offering official Federal Reserve advice, but I think there are other ways to get involved in banking through acquiring a bank or beginning to take an ownership structure in an established institution. Some of the things we talk about in the book, and I don't pretend to have all the answers, and my coworkers don't pretend to have all the answers, and we're trying to push the dialogue and recognize that the answers are going to have to come from a lot of different places. And so the things I think about is, the banking sector, and I'm including the Fed within this when I talk about the banking sector, needs to bring more minorities into the banking business. We need to figure out across the board how to bring more minorities, and so we can make minorities comfortable and build some of the issues of trust that you talked about earlier, and sort of how do we do that. And I think the banking system also needs to help people understand, the banks that we write about in this book and community banks across the United States, these aren't the big risk-taking institutions that sort of grab all the headlines, right? They are at a very basic level helping their community. And I think it's important for people to recognize what that means. And when you put money with a bank, really think about why you're doing that, where that money goes, who that money is creating an opportunity for. There's a lot of different solutions being proposed right now. There's the Greenwood Initiative, the online bank, and there's some other ones that have gained some traction. They aren't in a position to be able to lend, at least not yet. And while I think there are some benefits, for the individual to have a bank account just to save money in, when I really think about banking, I think about that lending function and growing the community. I don't think about it a lot as sort of where's the individual, hey, if we can keep people out of having to pay money to cash a check, that's great for them. But I'm sort of thinking that next step. How do we raise everything?
How do you lend for me to be able to buy commercial real estate? How do you lend for me to be able to open a business in the community? How do you lend for me to be able to buy my home?
Right.
All of those things that builds community, and that also is a relationship that we need to have fostered more. I think that's absolutely on point. What else are you working on, Timothy Todd?
Well, I think I should probably note that this book is actually available for free.
You should have led with that.
I should have led with that.
Come on, where do we get it?
You go to kansascityfed.org, which is my bank's website, and you can go on there right now and you can download a PDF. And
Come
if you don't want
PDF. I was wondering because I'm like, it's not on Amazon.
No, it's not. That's a whole nother story.
Okay, good.
But if you can go out there and you can get the PDF and you can read it tonight, or you can go in there and you can fill out a little thing, and we'll send you an honest hard copy of the thing.
Wow, I'm on there now. Because I was like, this looks amazing. And, the more we know, the more we know. To me, every bit of knowledge gives you kind of a framework for what you can do, what the possibilities are. And I feel like if people have done things, then you can do things, right?
Right.
And if so many of these people were able to do it in more adverse conditions than we have today,
right?
Not that there's no excuse, but
it's interesting because we were talking about Freedmen's earlier, and I think in the minds of a lot of people, there was sort of this narrative out there that, well, Freedmen's happened and there haven't been any black banks since then. Like no one sort of knew or has paid attention or remembered that there were a bunch of them, and they were hugely important in their communities for all sorts of reasons. And so, I think we're just honored to call some attention to some of these individuals and get their stories out there. And we've tried to write it in a way that you don't have to even really, think a lot about banking, just to learn more about the history and appreciate the work of these folks.